Alright, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you how to set up and configure Bitdefender properly. We're going to use some of the best practices to get this set up and running properly. I will drop timestamps down below. There's going to be one section you'll see where it's got like a warning. Make sure you read the warning, understand that stuff because it's super important. If you don't and you screw something up along the way, what it can do is send Bitlocker into recovery mode, and if you have data that you don't want lost and you don't have your recovery keys, you will lose everything. Now, encryption is super important, and we're coming into a day and age now where it's really, I think, important for basically everyone to have their drives encrypted, so that way if someone steals them or someone comes into your house and they're trying to snoop around with stuff, or anything of that matter, that someone just can't come in and access your sensitive data. So let's jump into it. Now, before I go any further, I'm just going to mention you'll have to do this through your BIOS, and every BIOS is different. So I can't tell you what it's going to be like for yours. You'll need to consult your user manual. In order to get the most out of Bitlocker and have the most security, you need to have your TPM turned on, which if you have anything basically like, I think it's Ryzen 1000 series or newer, or Intel 8000 series or newer, you should have a firmware TPM built in. Should be version 2.0. You'll need to go into your motherboard to turn that on. It needs to be done before you enable Bitlocker. This is best practice. You can run without a TPM, and you can run without Secure Boot, but to get the most out of this and have it be the most secure, you have to make sure this stuff gets turned on. The other thing is also, if it's not already turned on, is you also need to have Secure Boot enabled as well. Like I said, it's not required. You can still use Bitlocker without them, but it's very extremely highly recommended to get the most out of it. So before we get started here, one other thing is this does not work with Windows Home Edition, so you need Pro or above in order to use Bitlocker if you're on Home Edition. I may try and figure out a video in the future to use some different software to work around this as best as possible, but Bitlocker, when it comes to Windows, Bitlocker really is the best choice for encrypting your drives. Regardless of what some of the conspiracy theorists say, it works really well, and it's used by a lot of people for a reason. So to get started, what you will need to do is go down to your search bar and type in group policy and open that up here. And when you get into group policy, what you're going to need to do is navigate to computer configuration, administrative templates, Windows components, and then click on Bitlocker drive encryption. Now we're just going to cover a couple of things here real quick. First of all, this is best practice, but it's not necessarily required for home users. If you are, this is more used for corporations and governments where there's national security information that could be at risk, or sensitive IP for a business or something like that. But this one here, you see disable new DMA devices when this computer is locked. DMA stands for direct media access, and these, it says here it's pluggable PCI ports. Let's open up a article here from Microsoft. There's two different pages talking about DMA here, talking about protecting Thunderbolt and DMA ports. I will drop links to those down in the description so we don't spend a whole bunch of time talking about this stuff. But one of the things that you could run into if you enable this, as it says here, these PCI devices that have BME busmaster enabled set to 0, meaning disabled, they are not enumerated or basically enabled by the operating system until a user successfully logs on. This is by design. Additionally, after a user logs on, certain internal and external device classes may not work. These include, but are not limited to, wired network adapters, wireless network adapters, audio devices, and pointing devices, including touchpads. So that's just something to keep in mind. You could run into some compatibility issues. Like I said, this for a corporate or government environment, this is best practice, is to enable this. For a home user, you don't necessarily need this. It's not something that I would say you need to really get worked up over. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to boost the strength of the encryption method. So you have three different options here, and when you hover over these, you'll see this one only makes changes to Vista, Server 2008, so on and so forth. This one only works on these versions of Windows up until Windows 10 version 1507. This middle option here works on Windows 10 version 1511 and later, so 1511 goes back a long way. This also works for Windows 11, which is what I am using right now. So when you double click on this, there's a couple of things important to note here. So by default, Windows uses 128-bit encryption. Now there's nothing wrong with 128-bit, is more than sufficient as long as you use a good password, which we'll get into that here in just a second. But if you really want to step things up, now by default, like on government devices, this is switched over to 256-bit. Now, there's some, you could basically go and like find Reddit threads or threads on like Stack Overflow or something like that of people arguing about, well, is 256-bit really necessary? No, it's not, but it's good to have that extra piece of security there. Now, for a government, that could come in handy because let's say they lose a drive that's BitLocker encrypted. If they have this turned on, 256-bit is basically considered quantum computing resistant, whereas 128-bit, I mean, it seems like the theory going around right now is that it would be much easier to crack this if you had quantum computing. And so if they lost a drive with a lot of sensitive info, and let's say it fell into the hands of a foreign actor, well, all they have to do is wait until quantum computing comes along. They could basically crack into that hard drive a lot easier if it's 128-bit. So for home users, not really anything that's all that big of a deal to worry about. One thing to pay attention to here, select the encryption method for removable data drives. For the best compatibility is you need to look here at what's going on with this. So it says if devices are not running basically Windows version 1511 or later, you should use the CBC, AES CBC. You could use XTS AES as long as you are running a more recent version of Windows. All right, now that I've got my camera fixed so that it looks proper here. So we'll just go ahead and apply this. Like I said, you can figure out if you want to use CBC or AES here. Not really that huge of a deal. One other thing when it comes to passwords, we'll get into the length here in just a second because that's something that we set from here in the operating system drives where you go and configure the minimum length. For startup is if you use a weak ass password, your password is super important when it comes to encrypting these drives properly. So if let's say you use a password that's really stupid, like carrot, for example, it's going to basically be trivial to brute force that, because one of the things that a lot of attackers are going to do if they get a hold of a drive like this is they are going to end up using things like dictionary attacks, which, I mean, it would be trivial to crack through a password like that. So the length of the password, the special characters, the numbers, uppercase, lowercase, all that stuff is super important. We'll go into that more in just a second. One other thing before we get into it, this is going to be that important section that I told you about that you need to keep in mind. There's a few things with this. First, when it comes to the TPM, the Trusted Platform module, that's a really important part of BitLocker and properly encrypting and keeping your device safe. The thing is TPM, you have the option from within Windows to reset TPM. Some motherboards will give you the option to reset TPM. You could go and turn TPM off. The thing with that is if you do that, it will send BitLocker into recovery mode. So even though you know your password, you will no longer be able to use your password, and you have to use that, I believe it's a 25 or 32 character recovery code. You have to use that. And if you don't have that saved somewhere where you could access it if it gets sent into recovery mode, then it will lock you out and you will lose all of your data. So it's super important to keep your recovery key safe. The other thing that will trigger it is if you have BitLocker turned on, and you've got TPM turned on and or Secure Boot, and then you go update your BIOS. That's another thing that's really important, is it's going to change that stuff around. It's going to trigger recovery mode because Windows is going to think that something got messed with, and it's going to use that as a security measure. So make sure that you save your recovery keys in a safe place. We'll get to that more here in just a moment. Things here in group policy, if you go to operating system drives, the first one is allow secure boot for integrity validation. By default, it says if you enable or do not configure this policy, which is not configured right now, Bitlocker will use secure boot for platform integrity if the platform is capable of secure boot based integrity validation. There's a warning down here at the bottom that says disabling this policy may result in Bitlocker recovery when firmware is updated. So this was that BIOS update that I was just talking about. If you disable this policy, suspend Bitlocker prior to applying firmware updates. In general, it's better to just do this because, like I said, you'll end up triggering recovery mode. As far as I remember, this has happened every single time that I've gone to update a BIOS just to see if it does do that. It will trigger recovery mode. At least for me, it's triggered it every time. Next thing, require additional authentication at startup. This is referring to TPM. So I mentioned before, best practice is to have that TPM enabled, but it's not required. You could leave this setting off because, I've tried this with computers in the past, like where I didn't even have a TPM enabled. You can still use Bitlocker. It's just not as secure as if you have a TPM. So best practice is if you have a TPM, just click enabled and go ahead and just whatever the default settings here. The default settings work best. Keep in mind, one thing to keep a note here, if you do like require TPM and then require startup pin with TPM, let's say you make these settings here, but you don't actually have a TPM, then you go and set Bitlocker right away, and then you boot, it's going to send you straight into recovery mode because you don't have a TPM. This was something I had to learn the hard way. And I believe what I had to do was turn recovery mode off and then go fix this stuff. So you can just go ahead and leave it to allow TPM. That's fine. It will use a TPM as long as one is available. Next thing that you're going to want to do is double click allow enhanced pins for startup. Now, if you read this here, it says enhanced startup pins permit the use of characters, including uppercase and lowercase letters, symbols, numbers, and spaces. This policy setting is applied when you turn on Bitlocker. Now, if you just try and set up Bitlocker without this enabled, it will only let you use, if I remember, just numbers. It's been so long since I've not enabled this, but you want to enable this so you can use things like letters, symbols, spaces, all that kind of stuff, because that makes your password more secure, which in turn makes the encryption higher strength. The next thing, you could do this if you want to. This isn't a requirement. You could force a minimum number of characters. Ideally, you would want to have really at least 12. If you have really sensitive data on your computer, you can only go up to a length of 20 characters in Bitlocker. So if you have really sensitive data, you should probably just go ahead and set your password to 20, but you could just do a minimum of, like, let's say 12 or 10. I really wouldn't recommend going less than 10 on here. And you don't have to enable this. What you can do is just go and, when you're setting Bitlocker up, is just set the password to whatever strength you wanted at that point. One other thing here that would be good to keep in mind, if you're sharing a computer with other users, or you anticipate that you might be sharing a computer with other users or anything like that, is enabling this policy. It says this policy setting allows you to configure whether or not standard users are allowed to change Bitlocker volume pins, provided they are able to provide the existing PIN first. And if you don't configure or if you disable this, standard users will be permitted to change BitLocker pins and passwords. So let's say you have a family member, you give them access, you're probably going to give them a startup PIN, the startup PIN to get past BitLocker so they can log in and use the computer. If you don't set this, they could go change that on you. So like I said, if you're using a shared computer, best practice is that you would go ahead and enable this so that someone cannot go and change that PIN afterwards, you know, whether it be they're being malicious or they think they're being funny or whatever. So as far as group policy goes, that's really the important stuff, is what we hit on there. Now, we'll go ahead and set BitLocker. To do that, just go to the search bar, type in BitLocker in the search bar, and this will come up, Manage BitLocker. In this case, I only have one drive. If you have multiples, what you'll do is you'll go ahead and get your Windows drive encrypted first, and then go ahead and turn on the others afterwards, and we'll give you additional options for those, like, do you want these drives to require a PIN when you get into Windows in order to unlock them, or do you want these unlocked automatically if the operating system drive is unlocked? Just figure out whatever option it is that you want there. All right, so now we'll go ahead and turn on BitLocker. It's going to go ahead and run a quick check to see if everything looks good, and we'll give you a few different options here. So enter a PIN. This is the recommended method. This is when you go to boot up the computer. It's going to ask you for a PIN before you can start the computer. You could do a USB flash drive. If you're going to use this option, make sure that you keep that drive super secure and that you don't lose it or break it or anything like that. Or you can let BitLocker automatically unlock the drive. This is more of a convenience thing. There's some security issues that come with using this, and there's also some attacks that BitLocker is vulnerable to if you use this option. But what I recommend here is that you just stick with a PIN. This is the best option and is most secure. So as you can see here, we've got our minimum configured, so it's going to ask for the password, so you go ahead and set it now. The next thing, it's going to ask you, how do you want to back up your recovery key? You have a few different options here. First thing you can do is you can save it to your Microsoft account. For the sake of convenience and accessibility, this could be your best option. You have to weigh that against privacy. Let's say you are worried about whatever data you've got on your computer and that someone might be able to get access to that. Let's say, for example, you're a journalist and you're covering a sensitive story and you're dealing with some sort of government situation where things are getting nasty. In theory, what could happen here is the government could send a search warrant over to Microsoft and say, hey, we need to get that recovery key, and then they could go unlock the drive, because the recovery keys are saved on Microsoft's servers if you choose this option. The other thing is you could print the recovery key, or you could save it to a file. If you do save to a file, it will not let you save to the drive that you are trying to encrypt. It will say, hey, it needs to go to a different location. Now, let's say you're encrypting like C drive, and let's say you have a D drive on here. You wouldn't want to save it to a D drive and then encrypt the D drive, because then if you lost those, that could be an issue. So the other thing that you could do is print the recovery key. Here's a quick hack for you, is you could do Microsoft print to PDF, and we'll go ahead and click print and save it to desktop. We'll just go ahead and give it a file name here real quick. And so now we've saved the recovery key, so now you can go forward. Here's the next one. This is something that's important. It's going to give you an option. Do you want to encrypt used disk space only, or do you want to encrypt your entire drive? Best practice by far is definitely encrypting the entire drive. This is more for, let's say you've reinstalled Windows, you've wiped it out, and you're installing this. If you were to go with this option, only the disk space that is currently being used by Windows will be encrypted. So if somebody got their hands on your drive and they were to run like a recovery program, for example, they could pull off all of the data that you had deleted off of Windows before. So best practice always is going to be encrypt the entire drive. Next thing it's going to ask you, encryption might take a while. You can keep working while it's being encrypted. You can also restart your computer while it's being encrypted and it will just pick back up where it left off. And it's going to want to, by default, run a system check. This makes sure that it can read the recovery and encryption keys correctly. It does have to do a restart. It says it's recommended that you ensure your selected unlock method works without requiring the recovery key. If you are new to this and you're not quite sure what you're doing and you want to make sure everything was run correctly, definitely keep this selected. I've done this a ton of times before. I'm familiar with the settings that I have set through group policy, so I'm not worried about it, so I'm going to uncheck that. But again, if you're doing this for the first time, or if you've maybe only done this once or twice and you're still new to it, make sure you run the system check. It's super important. Okay, so now Bitlocker is going to run in the background here. You can see encryption is in progress. Like I said, you can still do work while this is going on. If you have like, let's say a 2 terabyte drive, it's probably going to take a little bit, especially on a hard drive. But like I said, you can go ahead and restart while that's happening and it will still work. Now, one other thing to keep in mind here is your recovery key. You need to figure out what it is that you're going to do with this. So let's just go ahead and open that up. Each of your drives that you encrypt will get a unique identifier. This changes every time. So if you were to turn Bitlocker off and then turn it back on, like disable it and then re-enable it at a later date, it's going to give you a different identifier. It will also give you your recovery key here. It's super important that you save this somewhere where if you ever need it, you can put this in and unlock your drive, because inevitably at some point something's going to go wrong. You could, like I said, you could update your BIOS, or something could get screwed up with your BIOS, or someone else gets on your computer and they're goofing around, or you make a mistake doing something with your computer and it trips Bitlocker recovery somehow. Like I said, regardless of if you know your password, it doesn't matter, because this will no longer, your password will no longer work and you have to have the recovery key. Okay, so we're just doing a reboot here real quick just to illustrate that this does work. So this is before you can boot into Windows. You'll get this screen here. It says enter the PIN to unlock this drive. Now you can do escape for Bitlocker recovery. You'll get some different options there. But if you go ahead and put in the password that you provided, it will go ahead and allow you to boot into Windows. And that wraps the video up. So if you have any questions or anything, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. I've got that super top secret project that I'm working on that's going to be coming, I think, a lot sooner than I anticipated. I thought it was going to be coming out in October, but I've been spending basically almost all my free time working on it, and I think we are almost ready to unveil what it is, and I think the community is going to really enjoy that. So with all that being said, thank you for watching the video, and I will see you on the next one.